want to ask some additional questions.
Well, hello everyone and welcome to 17, a micro-learning leadership series, which our purpose is to invest in staff development, focusing on new norms and innovation. The name 17 represents the length of time of the webinar, short and sweet. The concept behind the name is to communicate in an efficient, interactive, and non-traditional way. Please utilize the chat room to comment and ask questions throughout. Help me to welcome your presenter for today, Lynda Gonzales-Chavez, Senior Vice President, Chief Diversity Inclusion Global Officer from YMCA of the USA. She will speak on Unlearning Racism by Learning People's History. We will explore how history has been used to continue institutional racism and how we can learn from the perspective of grassroots communities most impacted.
And I'm Keith Benson, your facilitator for today. Here to ask your questions from the chat room and comment. So let's get started. It's all yours, Lynda.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Special thanks for the invitation. I'm so happy to be with you, and I'm so happy that you all are doing this kind of work. Entonces, vamos a empezar. We are going to be jumping into a journey, a quick journey with me. But as many of you know, history has been used to perpetrate institutional racism for the past several centuries. So how are we as a YMCA, as leaders, able just to learn from people's personal history? So this will be a journey with me. But something that I always find is that folks really don't know much about Latino communities. So to get us started, let's just talk about Hispanos, Latinos. But we are a multicultural population of mixed races made up of diverse national origins and linguistic groups. Our history is a result of largely Spanish and Portuguese colonization of native indigenous groups of the Americas. Our history is a result of indigenous eradication due to European violence and disease. Our history is a result of this massive forced enslavement of African people. In many spaces, the African enslaved people are who took over the work of the previously enslaved indigenous people. As I look at this and I look at the Native American medicine wheel, I also look at my own DNA history, which can further explain this journey. So my Asian roots. So as my DNA came up, indigenous Native American DNA is identical to the DNA of Eastern Asia. So again, giving proof to the famous land bridge, right? But the first Native Americans were Asian hunters who crossed the Bering Land Bridge more than 15,000 years ago. They evolved into the people Columbus mistakenly called Indians. By 1492, 60 million Native Americans inhabited South and Central and North America. So as you can see, this is our first part of our Asian bloodline. So I was about 30% Native American or East Asian. I also found that I was 5% African. And again, as we start looking at this journey for Latinos and our connectedness to Africa, over 10 million enslaved Africans were brought to the Americas. What many folks don't know is that 90% of those enslaved Africans ended up in Latin America and the Caribbean. Giselle being from Brazil, as we look at that, Brazil received more than 4 million of the enslaved Africans. In the United States, we were less than 5%. Another really sad part of that is that we bred them into slavery and how we look at that. But still, Africa played a significant part in Mexico, which was, again, the area that I identified from. So this context of Afro-Latinos, again, so important as we journey together. And then 60% of my DNA, Spanish. And when we start talking about race, we really need to begin looking at race as a colonial construct. Here you can see, and you'll have this map, I can send it to you so you can start seeing the massive colonization that we are and the roots of us. We cannot explore the United States and its institutional history of racism if we don't look at it through the colonial lens, through that colonial lens. So again, 60% being Spanish, and yet in the United States, although Italians were deemed to be white, Latinos, or those that came from Spanish and Portuguese backgrounds, we were never put into the category of white in the United States. That's why we still have that separate space. And census is really interesting because, you know, increasingly it gets confusing when they give you the option to, as a Latino or a Latina, to select any race rather than just the ethnic category that we are. Because in cases like mine, I include all races. And so how do we continue to just learn about that and understand what our history is in the United States? Something that is been really interesting for me in this journey is just having this opportunity, like in cultural lenses, this historical lens, just sitting and talking to people about their history. I'll also make sure that you have other resources where you can start journeying into these historical perspectives, including what is an exceptional read, the Howard Zinn People's History of the United States, again, because we know history is often written by the winner. History is often written by the colonizer rather than the colonized. I also now, as I think of myself as an Indigenous Latina, looking at this map, it's a simple map, but you can see this was really North America in 1821. You know, this concept of look at Mexico, look at the United States, and then what were the indigenous territories. But again, we have this massive colonial British force coming in the Northeast, and then Spain coming up here, and then the history of colonization of Mexico is one that many people don't know. I personally refer to myself as a Chicana, which is a term that many of us use because it shows that we're Mexican American, but it recognizes our indigenous roots from the very beginning, our indigenous roots. It's for me, it's just a very natural one. But as I think of the concept of Mexico, a Mexican American, and how negatively that's used, we talked a little bit about the history of Mexicanos. It would be so different. As I often say, with my family being here for centuries, I didn't cross the border crossed us. That's our history. And so even as we start looking at the many indigenous people in the Americas, oftentimes when you hear Mexico, you don't think that. And so again, that's what's so nice about this type of journey, to be able just to share for a brief time how deep our histories are as a Latino and Latina people. We know we oftentimes can be confusing because of the different terminologies and the fact that we come from so many different spaces and nations, but we do have tools and resources that will that further look at that glossary of terms. So that's another really big part of that. And so one other thing, just quickly, is in learning with in this quick journey, is the role of the Spanish Church. And so again, this depth of Catholicism and how colonialism came with Catholicism. Oftentimes folks say, what's one of the strategies to better engage the Latino community in the YMCA? And I often say, sometimes recognize that the YMCA is a white Protestant, Anglo-Saxon Protestant organization. We've had to take extra spaces and extra work to ensure that Catholics recognize the YMCA. But it's a really interesting thing how that part of colonialism still is with us today. So on this, I did want to just take a moment. I wanted to be very brief so we had time for conversation, but I just want to take a quick moment just to thank you all. But I want to light a candle today in recognition of the intense societal violence that's happening right now is a result of institutional racism. So just want to share this for those that have been victims in our space. And I want to do what I find very healing as I start looking at my Indigenous family and my mom and my grandma, and then the work that I used to do in community organizing, is just to burn a little sage. So this has been used historically to be able to help us towards a healing journey. When things are difficult, it helps us recognize that we are all one in humanity. And so as we continue this conversation, Keith and Giselle, I just want to say thank you for giving me this space to be with you at this time, spend a little bit of time with all of you. I just said to Giselle, it's like speed dating with the Dallas crew. Thank you for having me today, and I'm really looking forward to some questions. Gracias, todos y todas, mi gente.
Lynda, what great history lesson. Just really appreciate that. So we'll go ahead and move into after talk. And so for those of you all have some questions, interesting comments that have been going on in the chat room, if you have a question, we can come off mute and ask that question. There was, if no one has it, I'll start us off. I want to go back to the chat room, and there was a question of, let's see here, Dr. G. Dr. G, you had asked a question. I'll ask it for you, or if you want to come off of mute and
yeah, I'm sorry. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. I was still good. Hello, everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually am trying to understand when to use or to refer to someone as Hispanic or Mexican American. I know when, here in Texas, we've been always conditioned to say, Hispanic population. But when I went to California and I said Hispanic population, oh boy, did they like rip me a new one, like, man, so they only wanted to be called Mexican. And so I just wanted to make sure that I'm not offending anyone when I address them, and just want to know, how do we determine when to use the terms?
Sure, that's great, and great question. And I'll make sure that we get you the glossary of terms. But there's two umbrella terms that are used for all national origins, right? It's Hispanic or Latino. Hispanic is a government term. It comes out of U.S. Census. Originally, U.S. Census would capture, again, this confusion around our ethnicity. It would capture us under Spanish-speaking people, and then it was, Spanish Americans, and then this term came, Hispanic, and that was introduced again through census. But that only covers Spanish linguistic groups. The term Latino is another broad term, which incorporates both the linguistic, the Portuguese speakers as well as the Spanish speakers. And then for many people, so at YMCA of the USA, we often just use Hispanic Latino. But many people just want to refer to themselves from their national origin, like Mexican American and so forth, or this term Chicano that I just utilized. So many people will call themselves South American or Dominican American, or whatever region they identify with. But just real quickly, Dr. G, the best thing to do is really sorry, I just called you Dr. G. I think that's okay.
That's what she goes by.
Is just to ask people, how do you identify? How do you identify? And oftentimes they'll be very forthcoming. Good
Thank
question.
you. I appreciate that.
It does get very confusing, and people take it very seriously too. And there's all types of regional variations. And I know some places that just don't even use the term Hispanic anymore. And I'll actually ask if you ever have any questions about Latinx, I'm going to turn that over to my team, because that's still something that I haven't even really gotten my understanding around, is the terminology of Latinx. And I know it's got mixed reviews.
We have this same problem if we want someone to address us either African American or African or Black or, all of these things. So I understand
Right.
where you're coming from. Yes, thank you.
And definitely this, and Afro Latinos, when in Puerto Rico and in other spaces too, depending on how, again, as we looked at that map and the receiving areas of the enslaved Africans, and there's a real Afro Latino. You'll have to talk to Giselle about Brazil. The Afro Latino roots are just powerful.
Yeah, and we do have our, this is being hosted by our Dallas YERG group. And so for those who are part of that, this group, please chime in with any other thoughts and comments. I mean, there was some great history lesson that was given out there.
Woohoo! ERG, the Latino ERGs. I love your ERGs, by the way. Good work, Dallas.
So somebody had a statement here, maybe you can expound about it. Said they love your statement. I didn't cross the border crossed me. Can you dive into that maybe just a little bit more?
Sure. So I really encourage you all to look at the colonial maps of North America, because the border changed drastically over those years, right? So when the Spanish first came in, so down in Mexico City, so there you have this huge wave of coming in, that's the Aztecs and such. We have a term called La Raza, which is this new race that happened when Spanish colonizers mixed with the indigenous people, forced mixing. Then that became La Raza, or what are Hispanic Latinos. So you'll oftentimes hear that term, La Raza. So here you have this huge wave of Spanish coming in, colonization all the way up through Mexico, all the way up to New Mexico. And that was that first wave. Spanish occupied Mexico until 1821, Mexican independence from Spain, and that's when it became Mexico. So now the same area where my family's from, indigenous people of New Mexico, mixed with Spanish colonization, now we've become part of Mexico, so that becomes part of Mexico. And then when the Brits started coming in, and the famous Mexican-American War and all of that space moved in, that's when we started becoming this part of the United States. But New Mexico didn't become a state until 1912. So my grandfather was born in the 1800s. My mom is one of 17. And her mother was a native. So it's this, we didn't cross the border crossed us. New Mexico used to have we're the only state in the country where Spanish and English are official languages. Great question though, but that's the story of Latinos, is that we're an interesting people because we have both the colonizer and the colonized in our ancestral spaces. It's quite intense.
Gotcha. There was a comment that was made, and you spoke to this, says race as a colonial construct is not talked about enough. It said, I think it is erased due to folks being embarrassed because it was entitlist, and oppressive. I don't have my glasses on, so sorry about that, Lachey, if I messed that up a little bit. Can you talk a little bit more about that colonial construct?
Absolutely. Critically important is, and I would, again, this is how we learn, right? You start talking about people's history in a new perspective. It's really funny that we don't ever talk about this in our history classes, but yes, race is a colonial construct. I encourage all of you, we'll send you the resource, but race is actually something that was created to maintain whiteness. And so as we talk about race, it's this whiteness, and it became incredibly important in colonization because it was through this whiteness that they were able to enslave people that were non-white. And so this gets really deep again as you start looking at it, even through the lens of the church and the role that was in colonialism. But race is a colonial construct. It was there that we started putting people into the race categories. That, you know, at this point you have primarily Europe taking over the world and expanding on that. I think for a lot of folks, even in this colonial construct of Spanish, it is really interesting because of the colonial infighting. It's my theory as to why people of Spanish and Portuguese origin were never deemed white. I think that was part of the thing of being able to continue taking over all that space. I would encourage you all to also read the real story of the Alamo, for example. With all respect to the Texans and Tejanos, it is just history. But take a look at the Alamo and the demonization of Mexicanos in that space. Much of what happened there was a maintaining of slavery, because the first immigrants into Mexico, legal immigrants into Mexico, were these Texans that came in. So this last space in Texas, but Mexico had already made slavery illegal. And it was those Tejanos, the Texans, that were coming in and mixing with these, and coming in the conflict with these people. Really, a lot of that whole Mexican-American War was overextension of slavery. And you know, as Harold Mizell, one of my favorite mentors and leaders, he came into early ERG meeting of the original HLLN National. And we just schooled him. And he always says, "Oh, Lynda, let the truth set you free. Wait till I tell my wife that all those movies she's watching about Davy Crockett and the Alamo, she's never going to be able to enjoy them again." Because that really is a people's history. And I think that we don't really talk about it because there's been a lot in my space. I think that there was a lot in this rationalizing colonization that tried to separate people out. When I journeyed with you all about my DNA, one of the things that I thought was really interesting, 23andMe allows you to identify your most recent 100% ancestor. So I automatically thought, oh, it's going to be 100% Native American or 100% Spanish. No, 100% West African, Senegalese. It's you know, so I, you know, just think about those stories and mixing. That's really interesting. Just one quick funny story is my first time to Africa, or went to West Africa, and I was in Togo. Really in 2000, it was an amazing experience, that experience. And everybody dances, everybody was dancing. And these elder women from Togo came up to me and they brought a translator. And they said, "What is it about you? What is it about you?" And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" They said, "Tell her she dances just like a Senegalese man." I was like,
Okay.
I was like, yeah, that was my DNA ancestry coming through.
Lachey, you put a great question. We got about 2 minutes left. Lachey, you put a great question in the chat room. Will you come off mute and ask that?
Sure. I really want to know what your dream for the wise future engagement with Latinx and Hispanic communities. Like, knowing this history, how do we acknowledge that and then engage?
Right. So this journey that you all are on right now, and this whole journey that we're moving collectively forward on, is becoming a multicultural, anti-racist organization. It allows us to start having these kind of conversations so that we start learning from each other. Once we start engaging Latino communities, once we start doing meaningful work with Latino communities, especially those that are most underrepresented, those communities that are most underrepresented now, once we start engaging them, that's when we start building our pathway into good work. That's when we're able to start recruiting Hispanic, Latino, Latinx staff. bringing them onto our boards, meaningful engagement with our Latino suppliers, for example. It's really about meaningful engagement, and conversations like this really start meaningful engagement. This allows you to start journeying into each other, and once again, reclaim that ignorance, reclaim ignorance. If we don't know what you don't know, but even having simple conversations like this will help us get better and better at engaging communities of all backgrounds, but especially this gap area that we have around the engagement of Hispanic, Latino, Latinx communities.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well,
Thanks for the question.
This concludes 17. Lynda, thank you. Wonderful, wonderful history lesson. Thank you for sharing this with us. And so this concludes our series of Break the Silence. We will come back again maybe in a couple of months. But thank you guys for joining. This this has been recorded and will be put in the chat that you may be able to listen to at a later time also and share with others. Thanks again, Lynda. Everybody have a great day.
Gracias.
Thanks, guys. Great work. Appreciate it.
Los quiero mucho.